In the case of real estate investment, it's important to point out that China's property markets in recent years have become very closely correlated with changes in global liquidity. This chart shows Chinese month-on-month residential price appreciation. That's the dashed line. And the S&P 500, which is the solid line. And what you can see is that both of these series peaked at almost the exact same time in the second half of 2007, and both also troughed at about the same time earlier this year. I think what this shows you is that the Chinese property boom of the last 5 years has, to a very considerable extent, been the result of the monetization of foreign exchange inflows by China's central bank. And as these inflows have started to slow down, real estate investment growth has slowed dramatically. You can see that in the first 4 months of this year, cumulative investment in property development year on year was up just 4.9%, which compares to an average of something like 25% over the preceding 4 years, and a high of 33.5% for the first half of 2008. So given the weaknesses in the net export component of expenditure and in investment, can we expect consumption-led growth to keep the economy growing at the China's 8% GDP target? I think given the dire employment situation, the answer to this question can only be no. Job losses have actually occurred much faster this time than they did following the Asia crisis. In fact, during the late 90s, the main source of job losses was state-owned enterprise restructuring, which is a process that the government has a lot of control over. In the 4 years from 98 until 01, state-owned enterprises laid off 25.5 million workers. The extraordinary thing is that more jobs were lost in the manufacturing and construction sectors in just the 6-month period from October of last year until March of this year, when it's believed that 30 million migrant workers lost their jobs. So it's clear that the pace of job losses in the export manufacturing and construction sectors, where small and medium-sized non-state firms predominate, is much more difficult for the government to control than the pace of job losses in state-owned enterprises was during the late 80s and the early years of this decade. Yes?
What percentage of the total is that?
Actually, that number is very hard to come by, which is why I've resorted to presenting it this way. 30 million factory and construction jobs is something like estimates of the population of these so-called migrant workers, who are workers from the countryside who've moved to the cities. I've seen estimates ranging from 130 million to 200 million. So, as a percentage of that population, what would that be? 30 million out of 120 million is, who can do that in their head?
25%.
25%, is it? All right. But yeah, it's the problem in talking about this, of course, is that China has no really satisfactory unemployment statistics series. So, for example, the unemployment rate for the late 90s excludes all the state-owned enterprise workers, which is where all the unemployment was then, and the official unemployment rate for today excludes all of the migrants, which is where all the unemployment is now. So it's hard to say what that rate really is. various academic papers have put the rate anywhere from 9% to 18%. And then good luck getting any trend out of that. But in any case, I think it's clear that the situation with regard to employment is certainly the worst that it's been in any time in the last 20 years. I can't think of any precedent for the mass exodus of migrant workers back to the countryside that occurred at the end of last year. In fact, those train stations were always crowded, but they had always been crowded with people coming in. It was the first time that I'd ever heard of the Guangzhou train station being jammed with people going home in that way. Well, anyway, let's see. Right, AC Nielsen does a consumer confidence poll for China, and the results of their poll for the first half of 2009 came out recently. They found that 76% of respondents rated their employment outlook for the next 12 months as either not good or poor, which was up significantly from 55% of respondents in the second half of 2008. Not only is the employment situation more serious today than it was following the Asia crisis, but I think the social safety net is in many ways much weaker than it was then. The situation of the state-owned enterprise workers that were laid off was really much better than the situation facing today's unemployed migrants, as the state-owned enterprise employees often continue to receive benefits such as housing from their former employers. Today's unemployed factory and construction workers in many cases are unable even to collect the back wages that are owed to them, let alone get a free apartment from their former employer. A typical scenario has the owner of a bankrupt factory simply absconding with whatever remains of the company cash, leaving the bank's employees, suppliers, and other creditors to salvage whatever they can find of value in the abandoned factory. A serious weakness in the social safety net today is health care. There were actually health care reforms in 1997 which were supposed to increase the coverage ratio, but by now even the government has admitted that these reforms were a failure. Health insurance coverage actually fell from 44.7% of the population in the year following the reforms to only 33.5% by 2006. Recently, the government has announced a plan to raise the coverage ratio to 90% of the population by the end of the year 2011. But I think it's far from clear that this announcement will have any effect on the precautionary savings motive of the 76% of consumers who rate their employment prospects as not good or poor, when presumably the majority of those people do not have any health insurance coverage at present.